you very much for the opportunity to be here. We have a very short time, but this is very briefly, this is a work I did with some colleagues, including Pandi Pillai from Wits University here in South Africa, and Romulo Pinheiro from Norway, on a study on the development and the nature of the higher education in the BRICS countries. It's a book that just came out on Elsevier last year. And the main question, really, which we tried to deal with was to see how the higher education has been changing in these countries and how these countries' governments and society are dealing with higher education and what they are trying to deal with this kind of expansion. What the BRICS countries have in common, of course, is that they are leading countries in the regions, they are middle income. The higher education is in rapid expansion or transformation, and then the system, as they grow, they become very differentiated. I think it's a very central point. You have the public and the private sector. You have institutions which are mostly research institutions, or they are mostly teaching, and you have international, local, and national institutions combined in a different way in different countries. The idea of a pact is a kind of a general idea which we try to discuss throughout the work. And basically it is that higher education provides something for society, and society gets something back. And in this exchange, higher education becomes more independent and more autonomous. So in order to keep this pact going, higher education has to enhance its core values as places for higher education research, academic freedom, autonomy, social relevance, and they have to try to keep these values and these goals while everything is changing very rapidly, and it's not an easy task. And if they cannot do this properly, then higher education will suffer, and they will have less resources, they'll have less support in society, and they'll have more problems. So you cannot take it for granted, and institutions in the higher education system as a whole, they have to be able to adapt or to find the ways to adapt from the traditional ways of one functioning to the new realities which they face related to more demands, more demands for services, questions of cost, etc., etc. So, and of course, the students' expectations. So this is the general framework, the general idea. So we went to look into different societies, and the question was, how is higher education growing? What are the policies that the governments are placing in trying to deal with that? And how is the international dimension of that, international cooperation, etc., which are the policies? Of course, I will not be able to tell you much about this, but just very briefly, these are data you know, what are the BRICS and the different sizes, and although they are very different in size, South Africa much smaller, they are always, all of them are the main countries in the region, so that says they are very relevant. And then we'll look very briefly at the expansion. And this is the case of Brazil, that's my country. And you look at this table, and what you can see is that higher education has been expanding, but mostly it has been expanding in the private sector. And the reason for that is that the public system was very ambitious. It was established with a small number of universities which tried to be research, high level, and they were very expensive. They are free, you don't pay tuition. But then, as the demand increased for education, the public system could not cope. And the answer was to allow the private system to develop. So you see the green line going up, which is the private sector. You have the red line not moving very much, which is the red light. And the consequence of this is that today in Brazil, 80% of the enrollment more or less is private. And if you look at in terms of what the private sector and the public sector do, is very different. Of course, all the research is the public system. Public system remains free. It's very difficult to get into the public university, both in the most competitive field, because there is some competition for that in entrance examinations, and then people go to the private sector. And one of the policies the government has been trying to do is to support the private sector as a way to allow people to get into higher education, because if not, there will be a deadlock. So this is more or less what's happening in Brazil. What's happening in Russia Russia, of course, is a very different case because Russia had already a large higher education system in the Soviet Union. But then with the change in the Soviet Union, there was a very profound change in the organization of the Russian system. And again, you have, on one hand, in the past, central planning, and then more certification, more markets, more the private sector, and then, of course, you have Russian colleagues who can tell you better than I do, all the organization of national institutions, regional institutions, private, so it's a very much more complex system in which the central government has some ways of running it, but not completely, because there is a lot of markets and regional authorities, etc. What's happening in India? India is in extraordinary expansion. You talk about less than 5 million students, and then it grows and grows, and today India is probably the largest higher education system in the world in terms of the number of people enrolled. And it's very clear that indicated India is very certified again. You have very prestigious institutions and very not so prestigious institutions. You have a very strong policy for affirmative action, for the inclusion of castes and tribes. And as in Brazil, you have affirmative action. And at the same time, it is very complicated. The ability of the central government to run the Indian system is almost none. I mean, you look at the Indian, they have a large number of institutions trying to run it, trying to decide what to do, and they conflict with each other, and it seems that there is a dynamics which is out of the control of the government. It just happens, and it's very complicated. The regional is national. And then you go to China, and China, more than India, is an extraordinary growth, and here it seems much more controlled. Although, of course, if you talk with the Chinese experts, they'll tell you, well, the government decided to do this. The government made that decision. It seemed that everything came out of the government. But of course, this expansion is not just a policy. It's not that the government one day decided let's expand. This is part of a much broader process in which society, people moved to the cities, they had larger aspirations, they wanted to have more education, to have social mobility, and of course the government in China has more ability to try to run this, but it still is very complicated and is not very well understood really, because it's very stratified. Also, as we saw here, some of the Chinese institutions are moving very rapidly in terms of research universities, but this of course is just the tip of the iceberg, which is much, much larger than that. Also, China has some affirmative action for minorities. They have some policies for that. So it's a very interesting situation. But and of course, one of the most interesting is in the sense that they are moving very, very fast and very rapidly. And South Africa, I don't have to tell you, but of course, South Africa also had a fairly large system, but on the apartheid, very divided. You had the white universities, which are much more better supported, better endowed, and then you have universities for the black and colored. All this is changing. It's a big transformation. And in South Africa, we just heard the other day that 2/3 of the enrollment today is private, so the private sector is also is growing here as it is growing in Brazil, in India, in China, in other places. So this is the general picture, and I won't get very much into that, but in the different policies, I just want to mention in the few minutes I have how your rankings come into this picture. What is the role of rankings, and what's the impact of that? And I can mention these two aspects, the positive and the negative. The positive impact is that the rankings bring some international standards. You have to do research. You have to have some quality of teaching, etc., etc. Also, some institutions can be protected from the local environment because they're considered high prestige institutions. You can say, well, the government should give them money, should give them support, because these are prestigious institutions. So in a national context, it's very convenient for an institution to be ranked internationally. So institutions try to get that, not necessarily because they want to be more competitive internationally, or as all the discourse about rankings sometimes comes up, but very much as a way to protect themselves. And of course, they can contribute to the country's international competitiveness, but this is that you have to check if it's really happening. The fact that the institution does research, publishes papers internationally, doesn't mean necessarily that they are making their country more competitive in terms of technology, production, industry, et cetera, et cetera. And then, of course, what are the negative of the rankings? I think the main negative rank problem is that you may increase inequality because you concentrate resources in some elite institutions and you deprive the poorer institutions and the poor segment of society from support. And the other negative problem is that you can jeopardize institutional differentiation. And I think this is a very key central because the model one has in mind about what is a university doesn't hold when you're talking about these massive systems of hundreds of thousands of students joining higher education. Here we're talking about a very complicated system, different institutions, different size, different values, different goals, different ways of supporting themselves. And you cannot force into them the same model, the same goals, because if you try to do that, you have some of them who are able to do that properly, and then the rest trying to mimic, trying to copy that unsuccessfully and not really doing what they could probably do better, which would be to give better education and to play a more local role, which could be significant for society. So these are the main points. I think that these are the challenges that these countries are facing. They are facing massive higher education, mobility, people trying to move, question of money, how to deal with the private sector, and if you want to learn more, I'll recommend our book. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Simon. That was very interesting and useful to see the different sort of models that the different BRIC nations in particular have followed with expansion and the role of the private sector in that. We'll now hear from Denis. Denis is talking, as I said earlier, about African ideology and the decline of higher education in the humanities, which may or may not have something to do with the rise of the private sector too. But Denis, over to you.
Thank you very much. Is it working?
It should be. Michael?
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me, especially to Dr. Mekwe. I'm going to deviate slightly from what has been going on for the past several days. I'm going to talk about the humanities. And I noticed that area has been missing in the talk because I feel that there's no way you can reimagine a better universe in the future without reimagining the place of the humanities, because the humanities and the social sciences are where values are shaped, where worldviews are formed. And we know that certain worldviews can be progress promoting, other worldviews can be progress resistant. And we have to visit the place, the areas of knowledge where these things, the values and worldviews are shaped. And I noticed that in South Africa, which happens to be the only African country in the BRICS community, the social sciences, especially the humanities in South African context, I happen to have been here twice as visiting scholar, and I noticed certain trends in the humanities and social sciences. I noticed that the humanities in the South African universities are dominated by two intertwined ideological orientations. One is Africanization. The other is the anti-colonial paradigm. These two influences seem to be very, very pervasive in the way the humanities are done in South Africa. And the question is, the Africanization and anti-colonialism. We have a lot of talk about IKS, that's Indigenous Knowledge Systems. We have Institutes of Africology. We have African Renaissance Research Institutes, Pan-African Research Institutes. And all of them seem to be harping on the need of retelling the African story, Well, I was a little bit, when I first came to South Africa, surprised to see the enthusiasm with which these areas are still being pursued. Whereas in other parts of Africa, such enthusiasm seems to have waned. Then I met one professor of history from the University of Cape Town. Happens to be a white woman. She was asking me what I was doing. I told him I was doing something called post-Africanism. So when I explained to her, I said, well, the reason why the Africanization impulse is still very prevalent in South Africa might just be that South Africa never really knew its African moment. And the reason is clear because of its history, especially apartheid. So they've just kind of discovered the African moment. And that explains the enthusiasm. 1 minute, please. So I told her, well, I can now understand, because I was a little bit surprised. I can now understand. But there's also the need for South African universities to learn from the experiences of other African universities, where the Africanization policy was practiced immediately after independence from the 60s to the late 90s. We had most of the curricula in the humanities Africanized. We had African history, we had African philosophy in place of just philosophy. We had African sociology and virtually everything, African religion. So there was a lot of obsession with the African theme, trying to prove a point, trying to make a point about Africanity and so on and so forth. I told them that it got to a stage where even policies at a higher level were driven by the need to make an African point. And we had such things as the African Path to Development, which was the approved path adopted by the OAU then, now AU. And then we now have what we call African Solution to African Problems. Then we have African Renaissance and so on and so forth. So I just noticed that even though we had applied a lot of energy to telling the African story, the results were rather disappointing. The African Path to Development did not really yield to development. As somebody said, that it provided a lot of food for thought, but none for the stomach. The African Path to Development ended up in a lot of poverty in Africa, a lot of underdevelopment, and underdevelopment became chronic. I think in the 80s, in the 90s, there was a tendency for people to get out of that kind of doctrinaire position that you must do everything the African way and so on and so forth. So what I wanted to do here was to say briefly is that the Africanization of the curriculum in all these areas did not help Africa at all. The consequences were underdevelopment and chronic failure in nearly all parts of Africa. So one could establish a link between the persistence of the African mania, Africanization mania, and the result we got, especially the negative result. And this obsession with proving this, making the African points, we can call Afrophilia, defending the image of Africa, protecting the image of Africa against any form of attack. We can call it Afrophilia. And what's the link between this Afrophilia and the kind of negative results we've been getting in Africa? A woman wrote a book in 1994, a Cameroonian sociologist, said, what if Africa refused development? So that book was a little bit, was a kind of scandal to many people. What if Africa doesn't even want development? And her point was that unconsciously, we've been programmed to see development as the white man's thing. That we Africans should rather look for our own thing. So there's a kind of unconscious resistance to development because we see it as something imposed on us, something that's not indigenous to us. And that could explain one of the reasons why most of the programs put forward by the Africanization policy never really produced the desired result, because there is an unconscious resistance. Even though we might do all the moves, all the motions that seem to promote development, but there is some kind of resistance because there's been so much hypertrophy of the African theme. So what I try to do is to say that Since we have tried to define ourselves from a place of separation from the rest of the world, emphasizing our difference, rather than trying to integrate the values that have proved their worth, the values that come from the rest of the world, that is better we tone down on this discourse of Africanism. And the discourse of Africanism is actually motivated by the persistence of anti-colonialism. It was actually formed as a response to the colonial discourse. We didn't want the image of us as defined by the colonialists. So we wanted a counter image. So that before you can tackle the problem of Africanism, you must tackle the problem of coloniality. That's why I came with the notion of post-Africanism, an attempt to transcend both the limitations and the unconscious impulse that are imbricated in the Africanism. Now, in post-Africanism, there are two prongs, there are two axes of action. We want to kind of redeem ourselves from too much Afrophilia. And secondly, I propose that we should try to reconcile ourselves with our colonial history. Even though we didn't like the colonial starting points of our history, but that is the reality. There's nothing we can do about it. You just have to come to terms with it, reconciling ourselves with it. So there are two themes in post-Africanism: redemption from Afrophilia, what I call Afrophilia, and reconciliation with our colonial history, the colonial starting point of our history. Now, why do we do that? Because we defined colonialism in an essentially traumatic way. It came to demonize us, to take away our souls, to take away everything. And then we saw Africa as the counterweight, the positivity. We must return to our roots. We must find our own African approach to everything. So what if colonization is reconfigured differently? First of all, we notice that the whole world, the history of the world, is dominated by colonialism. Colonialism is responsible for the state of the modern world as we know it. Virtually every country, every nation has been colonized in one time or the other. So it's better that we come to accept the world that is this, the way the world is. It is essentially a product of colonialism. What we cannot change, we must try to accept and work with that. And then, this essentially traumatic interpretation misses a lot about the story of colonialism. Of course, certain aspects of colonialism were really bad, hurtful, and we have every reason to remember such so that they will not happen again. Nobody will do that to us again. But at the same time, we seem to have lost sight of the other side of colonialism, the gifts that it brought, the blessings that came with it. Now we focus essentially on the traumatic side of it. We will not see the other side. And that would influence our interpretation of our modern history, our interpretation of ourselves. So post-colonialism is an attempt to go back and re-examine some of the unlearned lessons of the colonial experience. So that rather than talk about decolonization, which is a theme that is very, very prevalent here in South Africa, we go back and learn some of the things that perhaps we did not properly learn under the colonial rule. And that will help us to reconfigure the place of coloniality in our lives. And that will help us maybe avoid some of these obsessions with going back to our roots. Our roots were made by our ancestors, yes, and they were good enough for them. But because the world has changed, the world has evolved, those roots may no longer be good enough for us. So the African way, the African path to development, if you look at it objectively, it's a kind of contradiction in terms. Because our ancestors did not invent development or modernity. They didn't need to because their life was different. They lived their own life differently. So the implication in the African path of development is we can go back to our past and find models that can help us to develop. So where do you find such models? Like African Renaissance. The concept is a European one. What is Renaissance in Europe? It's going back to the past to find a model of humanity, a model of humanity that can carry the burden of the progress of mankind. Because in Europe, they noticed that the whole of the Middle Age, the medieval period, had completely almost erased the Greek heritage, the Roman heritage. So going back to recover what in the past had worked, had served a better model for humanity. But when we talk about Renaissance in Africa, what are we talking about? Which past are we going back to? Where is the model that existed in the past that can help us today? I don't seem to see it. So there seems to be a kind of misconception that there cannot be an that is an African Renaissance when we are trying to move away from what was there, the pre-colonial period, to something else. How do we now go back to the past to find a model that can help us? Our ancestors did not think in terms of development. To them, the past, the ancestral past, was the model of everything good. Everything must try to go back to what existed in the most remote past. Now, development implies futurity. That is a time dimension that was not considered important in the past. And for people to get to the spirit of development, you must migrate to that time consciousness, not ancestral time consciousness. So just one of some of the contradictions. So in post-African, we say, no, we cannot be limited to our Africanity. We are far more, definitely more than that. We are the world. We carry the universe in us. Even though modernity was invented by Europe, it doesn't belong to Europe alone. It's the heritage of mankind. We cannot see ourselves as being separated from it. We are part of it. We are co-heirs to the riches of modernity. We should be co-heirs to the productive basis of modernity. We cannot assume our universal heritage if we keep on overemphasizing our Africanity. That is the message of post-Africanism. Well, I'm just giving here a very summary form. It was supposed to be a more elaborate thing. It's supposed to be presented in the first conference, The Meaning of Africa. Because essentially what we are doing in post-Africanism, how do we work out a new definition of Africa, a new meaning of Africa, such that what we do, the things, the thoughts we think, the stories we tell ourselves, do not hinder our goals to become part and parcel of the global world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Well, fascinating food for thought there. We have about 15 minutes for questions. So do stick your hand up if you'd like to get involved. Any comments, questions, contributions? Raj, here in the middle. I think there's a mic coming your way, Raj. We know who you are, but tell us anyway.
Rajkumar, Jindal Global University, India. Thank you very much for both of these presentations. Since the session is on the relationship between society and higher education, one of the things I would like to hear from both of you is the fact that to what extent society ought to contribute towards higher education financially. I never heard the word philanthropy, because what's happening across the developing world today is that one of the difficulties of prioritizing higher education is that governments doesn't have money to put in higher education. And we heard from the last panel that we need to engage the finance ministries, but that's a long journey. The question really is that to what extent we need to build in social contributions from philanthropic individuals towards investing in higher education, to what extent corporations, companies, business enterprises in the BRICS and developing countries have a larger social responsibility towards investing in higher education. And this question is equally relevant to Professor Ekpo's point in relation to humanities. I mean, there is a serious issue in relation to funding for humanities across the developing world, and even in the developed world, there is a withdrawal of funding in relation to humanities, and obviously we are not going to be dependent upon the state. In the interim, or let's say the state is not going to fund, how do we create alternative sources of raising resources, particularly from the society which has an important stake in higher education?
Thank you. Very important point. So the financing of higher education is up in the air, and we know that governments don't have money to pay for the expansion that we're seeing across the world. And this, of course, has an impact on the disciplines that people choose to study when they're paying for their higher education, and they expect a return on investment too. So lots of issues there. Which of you would like to, Simon, would you like to respond first?
I just have to agree. I mean, no government can really cope with the size of the demand, and of course, higher education today became a very big investment, really. I mean, you have companies, you have private sector, which are sometimes, in case of Brazil, you have very large companies which have large investments in higher education. For them, it's a big business. You have the vested interest of the professors and the students and the institutions, and all this is much beyond what governments can do. And I don't think there is an easy solution to that. Of course, the government have to prioritize and to see what, then you have some criteria of social relevance, you have criteria of social equity, you have criteria of relevance to values, and then of course the balance between the social sciences and the technical or the engineering sciences is always an issue, because many governments will say, well, we just have to invest on engineering because that's what produces things, and sometimes and not social sciences. So I don't think there is a simple answer for that. It's just a kind of, each country you have an internal fight and conflict around these issues. And what we did in our study, which was an empirical study, was just to see how the governments were trying to cope. And of course, some of them, they always make some decisions. And I think one kind of point which is important is that if you put all the money on the top elite universities, you might be doing a disservice for society. And if you just put all the money on the hard sciences, you are also doing a disservice for society.
I'll come to you in a second, Denis, but Simon, just to pick you up on you gave us an analysis of all the BRICS nations and the different, as you say, it's a very complex issue and there's no one solution, but the different models they've come up with to try and meet expanding demand, the mix of public and private and so on. Is there one of those BRICS nations that you think has done it better or more effectively or with better outcomes than all of the others?
It's difficult to say. I mean, if you look at them, China seems to be an interesting case because they have advanced enormously and they have brought lots of people into higher education. It's not clear what's happening below the top level, at least not for me, and even in the work with experts from China, the Chinese experts. For me, it's not very clear. As you go down from the top, very outstanding university, they were able to build what's happening throughout the system. There are some criticism that is very bureaucratic, is very ritual. People don't really get the creativity and the skills they're supposed to do. I have never heard anything significant about the humanities and social science in China. So all these are issues, but more the questions than really answers, because I think it's on one hand it seems to be successful, on the other hand is a system about which we have less information.
Thanks, Denis. I mean, as a professor of comparative literature, you must be very aware of the vulnerability of the humanities in particular with these trends.
Yeah, funding the humanities is certainly going to be a problem, has been a problem in the new liberal economy. Yeah, but I think one major reason why there seems to be a problem is that, especially in Africa, the humanities have not made themselves very relevant. As I said, they've been telling stories that are no longer relevant to the needs of the times. For example, the anti-colonial story, cultural recognition, the story of because we are more concerned about cultural recognition than about cultural growth and expansion. So when the humanities adapt to the changes in the world and the needs of the new context, I think there'll be need, either from the private sector or from government, to see the need to revive the humanities, to fund the humanities. Yeah.
But what does social relevance in the humanities look like? Because it's very easy to draw up, models for measuring the economic impact of the hard sciences, for example.
Yes.
Much harder to do in your discipline area. What would your sort of suggestion be for how humanities can prove their relevance?
Long-term thing, because the humanities is essentially involved with shaping the minds, the thoughts, the values, providing direction in terms of values for the society. Now, if you keep on telling the same old stories, and those stories are not being seen to be relevant to the needs of growth, development, and so it is not easy to measure, but you start by changing the stories you tell yourself and the world. I think if we start from there, maybe over time, there will be the need for the governments or agencies to see that, yes, these people can make sense to the modern world. Right now, we are not making much sense.
No, I just want to add that if you do something in humanities, you're not just within university, you're linked to society outside.
Society, of course. Yes,
And if you can do it well, society will support it.
Yes, of
and
course.
if you don't, if you just remain within yourself
Yes.
and talking to each other, then you may suffer with lack of support. I think it has to do with my first point about the PACT. I mean, the PACT is that university has to be autonomous, and in order to be autonomous and free of interference, it has to be relevant.
Yes.
So if it's relevant, then you can get support and be autonomous. If you are not able to be relevant, you are likely to suffer from interference, and then social sciences or the natural science and humanities can suffer.
Yeah, okay, great. There's a question down here in the middle, thank you. Sorry, I think the mic's just on its way. If you could just introduce yourself, thank you.
I'm Marta Lozada from Colombia. So you've showed this huge massification of higher education in these countries.
I cannot hear.
You can't hear me?
Sorry, yeah, if you could just speak up slightly, that would be great.
So you showed this huge massification of higher education in the BRICS countries, and you insisted on the question of relevance, and I would like to insist also on the question of quality assurance in this process. What are your insights on that? Because again, as you say, it tends to looks more like you're tending to a stratification in which you have very elite, but what about the quality assurance in the whole system?
How big, quality assurance, how big a problem is it with the massively expanding scale of higher education supply and the different models that we've seen? How are our countries getting a grip, or how should they be getting a grip on quality assurance and ensuring that people sort of at the lower end of the spectrum aren't, getting a higher education that isn't, as valuable as it should be?
I don't think there is an easy solution for that. I can talk about what's happening in my country, and I think in which there are many assessments, there are many standards, but they don't do something which I think should be very important, which to assess different things for different sectors of higher education. If you apply the standard of the research universities to the private, to the teaching institutions, of course they will fail. And then we say, well, these are very bad because they are not doing research, but that's what they are supposed to do. And at least in the case of Brazil, it has been impossible to convince the authorities with different governments that they should have a differentiated system to assess differently different sectors of society. They end up using the same standard. And so I think this is a danger. I cannot tell you what's happening in other countries, but I think probably you have a similar problem. You have one model in your head. The model is the big, national, the traditional classic research university with a lot of research, etc., etc. And then you apply this massive system, which is very different. And I think there is a very serious problem there. You either do the wrong assessment or you just don't do it.
Denis, I don't know if you want to touch on that as well, especially perhaps the divergence of teaching and research when we have increasing private supply. Is the academic profession changing, and are students perhaps being deprived of the student experience that we would traditionally expect them to have had in a mixed research and teaching environment?
Whether students are responding to?
Just wondered whether the student experience is not what it should be if they are ending up in teaching-only institutions, for example, if that's another quality issue.
Well, I can say something about the experience I have in my own country. Students don't seem to be really motivated these days, mostly because of economic factors. Survival, yes, especially in Nigeria where there's economic recession. The high motivation for high-powered research seem to be dwindling and so on and so forth. The response is just to try to cut corners, rely on the internet, get ready-made information, then give it to teacher, assignments, homework, and that kind of thing. There's really little room for original research on the parts of students. They just use the internet, get ready-made material, and give it to you. So that's my own experience from Nigeria.
Yeah. Okay. Any more questions? Question just here in the towards the back in the middle.
There's a lady there.
Thank you.
Question to the first speaker. You spoke about trying to measure world-class universities' contribution to the national economy, to economic competitiveness, and I wondered whether, can we measure how world-class universities contribute to national competitiveness? And I know that's a very difficult thing to do, but I wondered if you had any ideas for how, as academics, as researchers, we might be able to embark on that sort of research, which I think will be very helpful. And for the second speaker, I think that was a very courageous talk about Africanization, and I thank you for that, because I think you're absolutely right. It's very, very hard in a global world to detach global knowledge, European knowledge, and indigenous knowledge. And somehow we have to take the best of all our different worlds and put it together. But I think when students here talk about decolonization, they're talking about very many different things. And they're talking about the sense of pain, the sense of injustice, the sense of feeling excluded. And I think somehow we as a higher education community have to address what's lying underneath the term that they use of decolonization.
Great, thanks, Rajni. So, Simon, maybe we'll put the first question to you. How can we get a handle on this question of the contribution that academics and universities make to national competitiveness?
Yeah. Well, I think that's 2 points. I think the main contribution is if they help to have an educated population. I think a very competitive nation, everybody has to be well educated, and that's a very central thing. If you just do very good research in a few universities, you're not doing anything very significant. I think this is the main thing. And of course, it has to do with the role of universities to provide, not just for itself, but also for general education, the training of teachers. So there is a whole issue of education in general, without which you cannot really talk about competitiveness. The second point is that if you do a research following very strictly the academic pattern of publication, international publication, you are measured by that, and your prestige system and your reward system is associated with how many papers you publish and it comes up in Scopus or different measures, you might not be doing anything significant for competitiveness. Competitiveness has to do with industry, with investment, with links between the research and applications, and the whole reward system of academic research very often is not linked to that. So you might have a wonderful university doing lots of beautiful papers, and just a kind of an activity which is beautiful but doesn't really add too much.
I suppose there is the growing trend for governments nationally measuring the impact of research as well, and funding through that. We just have a couple of minutes left, so
Yes.
last word to you, Denis, on the issue of decolonization.
Yeah, thank you very much for your response. I'm a bit worried about the use of the term decolonization when you're talking about necessary reforms that should be undertaken in the university system in a context like South Africa. When you use the word decolonization, you're talking about repudiating the whole colonial heritage, which is not possible. As I said, the world is essentially a product of colonialism. You cannot repudiate what is part and parcel of you. So the problem I have is the use of the term decolonization. Because in African ideological literature, starting from Ngugi, decolonization of the mind, that's washing off all traces of coloniality from the mind. That's utopian. That's not realistic. It doesn't even make sense. We will be harming ourselves. So when they use that kind of radical sounding term, it connotes that you do not really appreciate anything from that heritage, and that there's so many things in that heritage you can use to improve yourself, to bring out a better version of yourself. So it is not the need for reform that I quarrel with, but the use of the term decolonization.
That was a fascinating discussion, I'm sure. Thanks so much to both of you for being here and for contributing, and thanks to all of you for your questions as well.